Hi everybody! Over the course of the past few weeks, we have been looking at Domain, how to play the deck, card choices in the deck, overall strategy of the deck, how to sideboard with the deck against the top 10 most popular decks in Standard, as well as looked at flex slots and different builds of the deck and nuances and where played patterns with Domain Zur in Standard. And so, this video is compiling all of those things into one comprehensive deep dive. Enjoy. So this is the Standard Domain deck. Effectively, what this deck is attempting to do is just play very powerful, sometimes undercosted cards in order to draw a ton of cards off of Up the Beanstalk. And the way we do that is by casting Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Overlord of the Flood Pit, and Overlord of the Mistmoors, because even if we pay the impending cost, it's still considered to be a card that costs 5 or more, because Up the Beanstalk says when it enters and when you cast a spell mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. So even if I'm paying 3 mana for Overlord of the Hauntwoods, it is still a 5 mana card, so I still draw a card off of Up the Beanstalk. So Overlord of the Hauntwoods is a 5 mana 6/5 with impending 4, meaning that it enters as an enchantment with 4 impending counters on it. You take impending counters off of it at the beginning of each end step. Or actually, I guess they're called time counters, but whatever. And when the last one is removed, it becomes a creature. And whenever it enters or attacks, create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere that is every basic land type, which also helps with our domain and fixes our colors, you know, all that stuff. Overlord of the Flood Pits is a 5 mana 5/3 with impending 4 with flying, and when it enters or attacks, draw 2 cards and discard a card, because again, it will trigger Up the Beanstalk. And Overlord of the Mistmoors is a 7 mana 6/6 with impending 4 for 4 mana, and whenever Overlord of the Mistmoors enters or attacks, create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying. All of these things, even when cast for their cheaper costs, trigger Up the Beanstalk. So you're getting a ton of value off of playing these creatures for really cheap. They all do really relevant stuff when they enter, but also they're drawing you more cards with Up the Beanstalk. In addition, similar thing with Leyline Binding. Leyline Binding is a 6 mana card that's enchantment with flash that when it enters, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Leyline Binding leaves the battlefield. It's effectively a flash O-ring. However, the spell costs 1 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. And so that means if we have Overlord of the Hauntwoods, then Leyline Binding costs 1. But even if we're paying 1 mana for Leyline Binding, it still triggers Up the Beanstalk. And so we're drawing a ton of cards and getting a great amount of value off of all of these cards. In addition to that, there is an additional combo with these cards with Zur Eternal Schemer. Zur Eternal Schemer is a 3 mana 1/4 with flying. Enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. Okay, that's on its surface, that sounds really good. Overlord of the Hauntwoods, Overlord of the Mistmoors, and Overlord of the Flood Pits are all enchantment creatures. So having Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproof with Zur Eternal Schemer on the battlefield is great. However, there's an additional ability. It's for 1 white and 1 generic, target non-aura enchantment you control becomes a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and base toughness equal to its mana value. So way this works is if you impend one of these creatures, it is not a creature, it is just an enchantment. However, it can be targeted with Zur. So for example, if you have an Overlord of the Mistmoors, you pay its impending, you get those 2/2/1 insects, and then you play a Zur Eternal Schemer and target the impended Overlord of the Mistmoors, it will become a 7/7 creature that still has that text that when it enters or attacks, create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying. Also, as long as Zur is on the battlefield, creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. So you'll be able to target this enchantment with Zur and attack with Overlord of the Mistmoors and trigger its attack trigger as well. That's also true with Overlord of the Hauntwoods and Overlord of the Flood Pits. And if Zur is dealt with, then these creatures remain creatures even if they still have impending counters on them. The reason I put Leyline Binding into this category as well is creating a 6/6 out of like no creature is pretty good. The issue with doing it to Leyline Binding is if Leyline Binding's dealt with, then they get the thing back, so it's a little bit harder. But they effectively have to, unless they have a board wipe, I guess, they effectively have to deal with Zur first because it also gives these enchantments hexproof, which is pretty powerful. So that's the core of the deck, and the rest is to sort of support that. So we have removal in Get Lost. It's a pretty unconditional removal for planeswalkers, enchantments, and creatures. However, when it destroys those things, it creates 2 map tokens. We have a single Elspeth Smite. Some decks are playing 2 in the main deck. This is mostly for the aggressive decks. It's a 1 mana instant. Elspeth Smite deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. We're playing a single split up. Choose one, destroy all tap creatures, destroy all untapped creatures against the aggressive-ish decks that you might be playing against. This normally wipes the board for 3 mana. And then we're playing 2 Sunfall. Sunfall, 5 mana, exile all creatures, incubate X, where X is the number of creatures exiled this way. And when you incubate, you get an incubator token with X+1/+1 counters on it, and 2 mana transform it into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature. So these are all of the removal. And then to support the rest of the deck and add additional power, we're playing 2 Analyze the Pollen. Analyze the Pollen is a 1 mana sorcery. As additional cost to cast a spell, you may collect Evidence 8, which is just exile cards with a total mana value of 8 or greater from your graveyard, which is pretty easy because we have a lot of cards that cost a lot. Plus, we have a ridiculous amount of Surveil lands because those are the dual lands that are domain colors. And it says, search your library for a basic land card. If evidence was collected, instead search your library for a creature or land card. Reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So this fixes our mana, which is awesome. That's important in effectively a 4-color deck. But also if we collect evidence, we can grab a creature. Grabbing that creature, it could be Azure, it could be one of these overlords. If you're grabbing it with Analyze, it's normally the white overlord because that's the most powerful. But also we're running a 1 of Atraxa that we can grab with Analyze the Pollen. That is a 7 mana flying vigilance, death touch, lifelink. When it enters, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand, put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. So this can just kind of end the game all at once, which is so good. And we're playing a 1 of Herd Migration. Herd Migration is a 7 mana spell with Domain. Create a 3/3 green beast creature token for each basic land type among basic lands you control. And you can pay 2 mana and discard Herd Migration. Search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, and you gain 3 life. So it's mana fixing, and it can sort of end the game in the deep late game. As far as the lands go, really we're just trying to be able to cast all of our spells. We're effectively 4 color. We can fix our mana a little bit with Cavern of Souls, and really all we need to do is cast a single Overlord of the Hauntwoods, and it fixes our color pretty good. We're effectively a green-white deck that are splashing black and blue, and then a little bit splashing red, even though we don't have red spells, red for the Leyline Binding. And in that sense, we're just making sure we have the best mana possible. As far as the sideboard goes, we have Authority of the Consuls for these aggressive decks and Convoke decks. Elspeth Smite again for these aggressive decks. Rest in Peace is our Graveyard Hate. Split Up is mostly for aggressive decks, but really things that have a lot of creatures that end up tapped and they plan on attacking with. Beza is pretty solid against mid-range, but is mostly for aggro and gaining life and being a blocker. Negate for decks that have non-creature spells we care about. Tear Asunder for enchantment hate. Also like fine if we want additional hate for other permanents, because it only costs 2 more mana and this is a big mana deck anyway. We're playing Tranquil Frillback for enchantment hate, also decent against aggro because it's a blocker and can gain life, and it's decent graveyard hate. Playing Anissa Ascended Animus. Most of the time we're siding this in for enchantment hate, or we're siding it in just as a finisher against decks that go really, really long. And then we're playing a single Doppelgang for super, super slow decks, which frankly, if we do this for X is 2 even, it normally ends the game because you can target your opponent's stuff and your stuff. So this is Domain, and before we start talking about the top 10 most popular decks, we should start looking at the sideboard. So Authority of the Consuls is for the super aggressive decks, especially the hasting decks. Elspeth Smite similarly for those type of decks as well, but also is a little bit more of a diverse removal spell. Rest in Peace is mostly for like the Tolarian Terror decks and any weird Reanimator decks hanging out. Split Up is a cheap though conditional board wipe, but very good against these aggressive strategies where we really need the earliest board wipe possible. Beza is decent against mid-range, but is mostly in our deck for aggro, being able to gain life, be a blocker, and possibly produce even more blockers. Negate, again, for non-creature spells, we're talking like the Mirror Match or Control or anything like that. Obstinate Baloth is starting to be played in these Domain sideboards. One, because it's good against the aggressive decks as a blocker and gains life, but also the Esper Self Bounce often has you discard cards with Hopeless Nightmare, which is very good against our deck, and then playing turn 1 Hopeless Nightmare and us just putting Obstinate Baloth on the battlefield can just win us the game against those Esper Self Bounce decks, which I found to be kind of a bad matchup. Nissa Ascended Animist is very good against any deck that plays a lot of artifacts or enchantments, something like the Mirror Match, but also really good against any slow deck because it's a great finisher. And then Doppelgang is an insane finisher for any of these slow decks. So the most popular deck in Standard is Dimir Midrange. Against Dimir, we are bringing in Elspeth Smite. Being able to deal with those creatures that are trying to draw a ton of cards against us is super important. And that is really all I like against the deck. Mostly because I don't really like Split Up, because it's really hard to wipe their board in that way. And then we're also just going to shave Overlord of the Flood Pits. It's the worst Overlord by quite a bit. And we're going to be shaving Overlord of Flood Pits like a lot, frankly. But this is our sideboard against Dimir midrange. The second most popular deck is Golgari midrange. Against Golgari midrange, we are siding in Nissa and Doppelgang just as those finishers like we talked about. But frankly, other than that, I'm running it back. This is an insanely good matchup. I'm bringing out an Elspeth Smite and a Split Up because those are mostly focused on the aggro decks, and that's how I sideboard against Golgari. The third most popular deck is the new hotness to standard is the Esper Self-Bounce deck. Against this deck, I've found that you need to be as aggressive as possible because if you let them do their thing, it's kind of just over. But Obstinate Baloth is excellent because of Hopeless Nightmare, and it helps you live, frankly. Split Up is decent to just kind of deal with their creatures. Negate is very, very good because countering this town ain't big enough, or Storm Chaser's Talon is just super important. And then Beza, mostly just have another creature to be attacking with. Gonna be taking out the Elspeth Smite. We can't really rely on it being a good counterspell. We're going to take out the Atraxa package. The Analyze the Pollen and Atraxa often kind of go together. And be taking out Overlord of the Flood Pits and just shaving on a Zur. The fourth Zur is pretty much a flex slot, so we'll be shaving the fourth Zur quite a bit as well, too. But this is how I sideboard against the Esper Self-Bounce deck. The fourth most popular deck is Gruul Prowess. Also, the slightly different deck, Gruul Aggro, is the fifth most popular deck, and Mono Red Prowess is the eighth most popular deck, and we're going to sideboard the same against all of them. The Prowess version being the Slickshot Show-Off version, the aggro version being the non-Slickshot Show-Off version. But we're going to sideboard the same against all three of those decks. So we're going to bring in Authority of the Consuls, we're going to bring in Elspeth Smite, we're going to bring in Split Up, we're going to bring in Beza, and we are going to bring in Obstinate Baloth. Notice the pretty big sideboard because this is probably our worst matchup. We're going to bring out the Atraxa package because we can't realistically get that on the battlefield. We're going to bring out Up the Beanstalk because we are not interested in card advantage. Bring out Overlord of the Flood Pits because we aren't really looking to draw cards. And we're just going to shave a white Overlord. While being decent blockers, it's really easy for them to outsize the blockers. And realistically, we aren't casting the front face of it. So that's how I sideboard against the Gruul and Mono Red aggro decks. So we've already talked about the fifth most popular deck being Gruul aggro. So the sixth most popular deck is Domain, the mirror match. Against the mirror, we're going to be bringing in Negate, we're going to be bringing in Nissa, and we're going to be bringing in Doppelgang. We're going to be siding out of Elspeth Smite. Split Up just frankly isn't very good. I also like bringing out Day of Judgment, because we need our cards to do more than just wipe the board. And shaving on a Sunfall. I like everything else. Keeping one Sunfall is totally fine. That's how I sideboard in the mirror. The seventh most popular deck is the Jeskai Convoke deck. Against Jeskai Convoke, I like bringing in Authority of the Consuls. Split Up is unreasonably good. I really like Beza just because it's an aggro deck. And similarly with Obstinate Baloth, we're going to be bringing out the Atraxa package and Up the Beanstalk for similar reasons, right? I'm not looking to play that long game. I'm looking to answer what they're doing and move on. This high sideboard against Jeskai Convoke. We've already talked about the eighth most popular deck, which is Mono Red Prowess. So the ninth most popular deck is the Mono White Token Control deck. Against this deck, we are bringing in Negate, we are bringing in Nissa and Doppelgang, just mostly as finishers. We are siding out of Elspeth Smite. I don't like Split Up, but I do like the other board wipes being able to just kind of reset after the control craziness. And we're going to just be shaving on Zur and Blue Overlord, and that's how I sideboard against Mono White. And then the 10th most popular deck is the Azorius Convoke deck, Azorius Aggro, Azorius Curiosity, whatever you want to call it. I really like Authority against this deck. I also like Elspeth Smite more against this deck than the Jeskai deck. Being able to deal with Enduring Curiosity forever is really nice. Split Up is very good, and Obstinate Baloth is very good, and Beza is very good. We're going to side out of our Atraxa package, get rid of Overlord of the Flood Pits. I'm not looking to grind, so I'm going to shave on cut up the Beanstalk, excuse me. And then we're going to cut a single Zur, and that's how I sideboard against the Azorius deck. So these are the non-flex slots in Domain. Is these 41 cards in the main deck, including a bunch of lands, and these 5 cards in the sideboard. So when you decide to pick up Domain, you're certainly playing these 41 cards in the main deck and these 5 cards in the sideboard. So the decision you have to make is what 19 cards are you filling these slots in the main deck, and what 10 cards are you filling these slots in the sideboard? These are your options. You have 45 cards to pick from in the main deck and 27 cards to pick from in the sideboard. Now, I think this is kind of obvious to say that there's no major stock list for Domain at the moment, which is a little rough, but also very good because you can kind of twist it to be able to support whatever you think the meta is going to be. Let's start with why you would pick any of these cards. So you're going to pick 7 of these lands to finish out your main deck suite. And really, I would love to provide insight on the lands, but I'm gonna be totally real with you, I'm not good at building mana bases. But you have 16 options to play in those 7 slots, and so, yeah, I suggest playing plenty of green because hitting your green overlord is super important. And if you're playing the pest control version, or like you're playing a bunch of Zur, making sure you have black mana that isn't the basic or Cavern of Souls is pretty important as well. But you're gonna pick 7 of those lands. To kind of move further along, the reason you would play up to 3 Analyze the Pollen, most decks are only playing 2 though, is it allows you to fix your mana. Being an essentially 4-color deck is pretty important. And then in the late game, you can collect evidence. We don't use our graveyard, so we can collect evidence pretty easily to grab powerful cards from our deck, whether it be Zur, White Overlord, or Atraxa are our normal targets. You can play Get Lost 3 and 4. Get Lost is a great unconditional removal spell, really good against enchantments. The issue is it gives maps, and maps are really good alongside the Valiant cards in the red deck. So while Get Lost is good against the red deck, being able to trigger Valiant while not using their cards and just like popping a map on their own creature, a map that you gave them, can be kind of rough. So people are going a little bit down on Get Lost. You can play up to 2 Pest Control. Pest Control, destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less, and more importantly, it has cycling too. So the reason this is playable in the main deck, even though it's obviously targeting very specific decks, is because it has cycling. You can just have it replace itself. And the reason you'd be playing these in the main deck is it's decent against the red decks. It's like fine, but mostly for the bounce decks, because things like Hopeless Nightmare and stuff like that are really, really rough, and Pest Control deals with most of the cards in their deck for just 2 mana. You can play up to 2 Split Up. Now, Pest Control has kind of taken the Split Up slot recently, but Split Up being a 3-mana board wipe that doesn't take out your own Up the Beanstalk like Temporary Lockdown does is really solid. It can be a little conditional, but frankly, the decks that you want Split Up against are the decks that are either going to have like all their creatures tapped like Convoke or Aggro. So Split Up is totally solid. Speaking of Temporary Lockdown, you can play up to 3 Temporary Lockdown. It is a less conditional removal spell than Split Up against the decks that you want these cards against. However, it takes out Up the Beanstalk and like any tokens you have, so that's a little awkward as well. You can play Zur number 3 and 4. Now, Zur is excellent because you can man up the giant enchantments that you have, especially the Impended Overlords, and when they attack, you can still get their attacking triggers. You know, they have Death Touch, Lifelink. It can be total game ender a lot of the time. The issue is Zur doesn't really do anything on its own, so it's a little weird, and people are going down from the original 4. You play 1 Beza. Beza is decent against pretty much every deck but the combo decks. It gains life, it's a blocker, it's a threat, sometimes it can draw cards or ramp you mana. It's just all around decent against super aggressive decks and super slow decks. You can play a single Day of Judgment, just more unconditional removal than Split Up or Pest Control, though notably Pest Control deals with non-creatures where Day of Judgment doesn't. Seized from Slumber, it's really interesting cards that a lot of decks are playing. They're playing up to 3. Seized from Slumber is a 5-mana instant that says destroy target creature. However, it only costs 2 mana if it targets a tap creature. So it's a 2-mana, pretty unconditional removal for these aggressive decks. And so people are going down on Get Lost for that because of that map thing I was talking about. I'm not sure if it's good, but it's working for people. You can play Sunfall 3 and 4. Sunfall is destroying or exiling all creatures, which is notably important, especially against the Enduring cards, but also it creates an Incubator token, which is a threat in and of itself. Very good. However, 5 mana is a lot of mana if you plan on using it against the aggressive decks, so it's kind of rough. You can play 3 Overlord of the Flood Pit. Overlord of the Flood Pit being a pretty powerful card if the game's going long. It does absolutely nothing if the game is short. Being able to draw 2, discard 1 with the Overlord impending stuff is definitely excellent in some situations and totally awful in others. You can play the 4th Overlord of the Mistmoors, which is probably the most powerful, like raw power Overlord. However, 7 mana is a lot of mana, and sometimes the tokens just do nothing. So people have been going down to 3, and casting 1 in the matchups that it's good against is normally enough. You can play up to 3 more Herd Migration, so Herd Migration 2 through 4. Herd Migration fixes your mana, kind of like Analyze the Pollen, and then it's also a finisher, and gaining life is pretty relevant as well. You can play a 1 of Atraxa. 1 of Atraxa is pretty nice against those decks that go really long, and pairs really well if you happen to be playing the Analyze the Pollen version, because the 1 of turns into maybe a 3 of or a 4 of or whatever, depending on how many Analyze the Pollen that you're playing. And so in the deep late game, you could just play Analyze the Pollen, grab Atraxa from your deck, and win the game. So you're going to be selecting 19 of these 45 cards to be putting into your main deck. And then let's look at the sideboard. So you're going to be selecting 10 of these 27 cards to put in your sideboard. You can play 3 Authority of the Consuls. These are mostly for, again, the aggressive decks. Aggressive decks are kind of a rough matchup, to be totally real with you. And so there's a lot of cards in the sideboard that are slanted towards these aggressive decks. Authority lets it gain life, makes your haste stuff can't attack the turn it comes out. It's pretty great. You can play up to 2 Elspeth Smite in the sideboard. Again, mostly for the aggressive decks. Also fine against like Mosso Dread Knight and dealing with like the blue Enduring card and stuff like that. You can play Destroy Evil. Destroy Evil dealing really well with like Shieldred, which can be kind of rough if we have a multiple up the Beanstalk hand, but also really awesome enchantment hate. I've already talked about Get Lost being unconditional removal. However, giving map tokens is kind of awkward. You can play 1 Not on My Watch. Exile target attacking creature. Really solid against, again, the blue Enduring creature, but also decent against the aggro decks. Exile's pretty relevant against like Heartfire Hero and stuff. You can play 2 Beza in your sideboard. We already talked about Beza, but Beza being very good against the aggressive decks and very good against the super slow decks, being a threat, can draw cards and gain life. You can play Negate number 3. Negate number 3, solid against these slower decks that are playing these non-creature spells that we care about. You play up to 2 Tishana's Tidebinder. Tishana's Tidebinder is an awesome threat, but countering these triggered abilities is really solid, especially against these Overlord decks. Also turns off the blue Enduring card and all that stuff. You can play 2 Jace the Perfected Mind, very good against these slower decks, especially the mirror match, that are going to go very, very long, allowing you to draw cards in the mid game and mill them out in the late game. Tear Sunder, great artifact or enchantment hate, also unconditional removal for 4 mana if the game goes very, very long. Tranquil Throwback is a little like Beza, in my opinion, where it's decent against it, where it's okay against a bunch of different things. It's decent against aggro because you can gain life and it's a blocker. It can deal with artifacts and enchantments and it's a threat. It's graveyard hate, but not great graveyard hate. So Tranquil Throwback is a jack of all trades, master of none. You can play Obstinate Baloth 2 through 4. Obstinate Baloth is very good against aggro. However, aggro has ways to deal with it. But the big reason that Obstinate Baloth is coming into the mainstream again is because of Hopeless Nightmare from the bounce decks. So the bounce decks are really, really rough. It's a big reason why Pest Control is becoming popular again. If they go turn 1 Hopeless Nightmare, you just go Obstinate Baloth and stare at them, and it's hilarious. You play up to 2 Nissa Ascended Animus. Nissa Ascended Animus is great against any deck that goes very, very slow. It's a great finisher, but also great artifact and enchantment hate, and it is just an all-around great card against these slower decks. We've already talked about Pest Control, but again, it's mostly for these aggressive decks and the bounce decks. You can play a Doppelgang, very good, similar to Nissa. It is just a finisher. If you ever do it for X's 2 or more, the game's just over. And then Ghost Vacuum is a great graveyard hate. So you're going to be selecting 10 of these 27 cards to add to your non-flex slots in the main deck, and 19 of these 45 cards to add to your deck, and then you have your very own but stock Domain Zur Overlords deck. First off, Overlord of the Hauntwoods gives you Domain, right? The Everywhere token is one of each basic land type, which means that with a single Everywhere, Leyline Binding costs 1. Period. That's really important to remember. Also, with a single Everywhere, you get 5 beast tokens. With herd migration, everything that might have to do with domain, you get with 1 Overlord of the Huntwoods trigger. Second off, and the big reason you're playing this deck in the first place, so I hope you already know this, but it's important to mention, is that Zur combos with the Overlords incredibly well. If you activate Zur on an impended Overlord and then attack with it, you still get the attack trigger. You don't have to wait for the thing to be unimpended. By it being impended, it doesn't remove the text on the card. That is a creature enchantment that is attacking. It also gives us this Death Touch, Hexproof, Lifelink, the things that Zur normally gives an enchantment it activates on. And speaking of those Zur activations, if your opponent is attempting to remove one of your enchantments, whether it be an impended Overlord or a Leyline Binding or up the Beanstalk, you can activate Zur on it to give it Hexproof in response and have that spot removal for your enchantment fizzle. And also remember that Up the Beanstalk doesn't care if a cost is reduced for it being mana cost 5 or greater. So your Overlords being impended will still trigger Up the Beanstalk, and you casting Leyline Binding for 1 mana is still going to trigger Up the Beanstalk. It's kind of what makes the deck very good. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.